Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual UQ NAIDOC Week Keynote lecture, where we are joined by Mr. Joshua Creamer, barrister at law. On behalf of the University of Queensland, I'd like to pause to acknowledge the traditional owners and their ongoing custodianship of the land upon which we meet here today. I pay my respects to their ancestors and descendants and extend the same respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples attending this Keynote lecture, both in the room and online. I acknowledge the contemporary Queensland First Nations community who continue to maintain their identity, culture and Indigenous rights over their traditional lands and waters. I acknowledge the ongoing contributions of all Indigenous Australians to national and global society. May we continue to work respectfully together in the spirit of reconciliation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Professor Rick Bigwood. I'm the Academic Dean and Head of School of the T.C. Byrne School of Law here at the University of Queensland, and I'll be your MC for today's events. Most people don't know me as a talented MC because I'm not. I would like to acknowledge in attendance Professor Deborah Terry AC, Vice-Chancellor and President of the University of Queensland, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Indigenous Engagement at this university, the Honourable Nathan Jarrow, members of Senate and UQ's University Senior Executive Team, some of our Indigenous professors and associate professors here at UQ, Professor Tracy Bunder, Professor Anne Patel-Gray, Associate Professor Stephanie Gilbert, Professor Thelma Parker and Professor Anita Heiss. And welcome to the elders and community members and other UQ colleagues and all distinguished guests. Before we begin, I'll play flight attendant with a bit of housekeeping in the unlikely event of an emergency. That's how they put it on the flights, I've noticed. Please evacuate in an orderly fashion via the fire exits located at the back of the auditorium. Please proceed to the designated assembly points and follow any instructions from fire wardens or emergency personnel. Toilets, including accessible facilities, are located just outside the auditorium. To begin today's proceedings, I'd like to invite Tribal Experiences to the stage to perform the Welcome to Country.
Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We are the Tribal Experience Aboriginal dancers, descendants of the Yagara and Turrbal tribes of Brisbane, and some of us are also descendants of neighbouring tribes throughout southeast Queensland. We'd like to welcome you here today with a welcoming song and dance we call Malacha, which is a welcoming song and dance to welcome you. Also to welcome the good Nora, good ancestor, good spirit. Yo nanyi akara Nora, yo nanyi nabuli akara Malacha, yo wait. Nanare koda Malacha koda nanare na minjana maladai nangara minjana maladai nangara nanare koda Malacha koda nanare chai hop nanare koda Malacha koda nanare na minjana maladai nangara nanare koda Malacha koda nanare chai hop nanare koda Malacha koda nanare na minjana maladai nangara yo. Welcome. Some of us are also descendants of the Kumba Mary tribe from the Gold Coast region, And this next song and dance we're going to do for you is a totem dance. For those of you who don't know what a totem is a representation of your clan or your family group. This could be a tree or an animal. As the Kulbamari tribe is the wedge-tailed eagle, which we call Mibin. This is Mibin, the eagle. Mi banana you day, are you daddling on? 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 Chai, 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 chai. Mi banana you day, are you daddling on? 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 Chai, 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 chai. Mi banana you day, are you daddling on? 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 Chai, 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 chai. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to our last song of this we call Jagana, which means paying respect to Mother Earth. For we as Aboriginal people believe that we don't own the land owns us. We're just here to look after and maintain it as best we can. This is Jagana, Mother Earth. Would like to say Nanya Nabali. You've been a wonderful audience. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you and welcome everyone. Happy NAIDOC week.
Thank you, Tribal Experiences, for your wonderful welcome to country. I'd like now to introduce Professor Deborah Terry, AC, Vice-Chancellor and President at the University of Queensland, onto the stage to address us.
Thank you very much, Rick. And can I too acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the lands on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge all of our special guests, Mr. Joshua Creamer, Barrister at Law and our guest lecturer this afternoon, Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Indigenous Engagement, and our other Indigenous leaders here with us. Thank you for all that you contribute to UQ. The Honourable Nathan Jarrow and other members of Senate, elders and community members, UQ colleagues, alumni, students and distinguished guests. Good afternoon and welcome one and all, both here and online, to the annual UQ NAIDOC Week Keynote Lecture, the centrepiece of our NAIDOC Week celebrations here at UQ. This year, of course, carries special significance as we mark 50 years of NAIDOC Week being recognised as a national celebration. 50 years of elevating the voices, cultures, achievements and enduring strength of Indigenous peoples and communities throughout Australia. By comparison, this keynote lecture is a relatively new initiative, but nevertheless it has quickly become an important forum for reflection, for dialogue and for hope. In 2023, we were honoured to hear from distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, AO, who delivered the inaugural UQ NAIDOC Week lecture. Then last year we heard a moving and courageous speech from UQ alum Professor Megan Davis, AC, who delivered her lecture in the form of a letter to her young niece, Mimi, written in the wake of the Voice referendum. That was a deeply personal and stirring address that I'm sure lives on in the memory of everyone who was here in this room exactly a year ago today. In that lecture, Megan urged young Mimi to march on and walk with others in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. And she reminded us, and I quote, that the future of our country can be bright if it is co-created by all Australians. That message of hope and collective responsibility echoes through the theme of this year's NAIDOC Week, which is the next generation, strength, vision and legacy. This theme is a reminder that the future isn't something we just passively wait for, but rather it's something we can co-create by acting with courage, vision and collaboration. And this is an area in which universities have an absolutely critical role to play. As I'm sure you're all aware, our unifying mission at UQ is to deliver for the public good through excellence in education, research and engagement with our communities and our partners. But our university is also an institution that's fundamentally dedicated to societal progress as a place where new ideas take shape, where knowledge is shared, where leaders are formed, and where change can begin. And of course, one area in which we're absolutely determined to make a difference is by helping to build a better and more just future for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and communities. That determination is reflected in our most recent commitments, particularly through our new Stretch RAP and our Indigenous Employment Strategy, which were both launched late last year. These are more than just documents. They're instruments of accountability. They commit us to lifting our ambition in terms of promoting respect, building stronger relationships, and creating opportunities for Indigenous Australians. And in doing so, they offer us a roadmap to help guide our work in advancing reconciliation and helping to shape a better and shared future. We also acknowledge, of course, that true reconciliation can only be achieved through a process of truth-telling and by actively promoting a greater awareness of the history and lived experience of Indigenous Australians. That requires a genuine commitment to listening to Indigenous perspectives, and especially the voices of community leaders who are seeking to advance reconciliation. So we are very privileged to have one of those leaders here with us today, Mr. Joshua Creamer, to deliver the UQ NAIDOC Week Keynote lecture for 2025. On behalf of the whole UQ community, Joshua, I want to sincerely thank you for giving us your time and for sharing your insights into a topic that is so vitally important to the national project of reconciliation. I'd also like to thank all of you for joining us here today and for being part of this important conversation. And it's now my great privilege to welcome to the stage Professor Bronwyn Fredericks, UQ's Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Indigenous Engagement, to formally introduce our 2025 NAIDOC Week speaker. Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
Hope you're going to still have some applause left for later for Joshua, because he's going to need that, and it'll be well worth holding it all in. Thank you, everybody. I do want to thank Tribal Experiences, and they may be just cleaning themselves up and having something to eat at the moment, but that was a great performance we had from them this afternoon. As is customary, I also too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which this gathering's taking place, elders past and present, and thank them for their custodianship and ongoing care and love of country. I also want to make special mention of any elders that are from this country in the room tonight, and any of the descendants of peoples in the room tonight as well, young people who are from this place. I acknowledge all of you. I would like to acknowledge our special guests, in particular, Josh Creamer, barrister at law, who's giving the address this evening, keynote speaker, Professor Deborah Terry, the Vice-Chancellor and President, the Honourable Nathan Jaro, and I haven't seen Nathan come in, but I'm sure he's here, he's over there, member of Senate, other members of Senate who may be here, UQ's University's senior executive, and I've seen, you've already heard from Rick as a senior leader, but we also have the Dean of Haas here, Heather Swicker as well. Plus there may be others in the audience or watching online. I want to make mention again, and Professor Bigwood did, of the Indigenous professors, but one of the things for me nowadays, I used to get on stages and be the only one in a room. And now the fact that tonight we have Professor Tracy Bunda, Professor Anne Patel-Gray, Associate Professor Stephanie Gilbert, Professor Thelma Parker, Professor Anita Heiss in the room with me, gives me great joy, as does the fact that we've got Honourable Nathan Jaro and Josh Creamer, two lawyers as well with us. But when we talk about the theme for NAIDOC being about legacy, that is also part of the legacy that we stand on, those that came before us, that we can all be in this room together now because of the legacy that was created for us, and it's up to us to keep that going. I wish to thank elders and community members that are also here, friends, donors, alumni, and students, all the distinguished guests. I welcome you to the 2025 NAIDOC Week Keynote Address. This year, as in previous years, it's an opportunity for UQ and the broader community to come together and learn from a distinguished Indigenous speaker. Each year, the speaker aligns the presentation with the NAIDOC theme. And this year, 2025, the theme is the next generation, strength, vision, and legacy. This year's theme speaks directly to the heart of who we are as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. It reflects the unwavering strength of our communities, strength born from generations of resistance and resilience, strength from courage, and strength from cultural continuity. It celebrates the visions of our ancestors, the fact that I can name professors in the same room as me these days and have lawyers in the same room as me, and maybe others who have got professions and students who are studying to be, speaks to the visions of our ancestors of the past. We're also the visions of those that come beyond, from the future. It celebrates their visions, a vision that now lives on through the young leaders, bold and grounded, ready to shape a future where Indigenous voices lead and continue to lead. It honours our legacy, a story of survival, of connection to culture and country, and of relentless pursuit of self-determination. It's a legacy we carry today, and one which we also need to entrust to those who will lead tomorrow. And there's been some pretty powerful messages spoken over the last couple of weeks about the future generations. I also want to say it's really beautiful to have this at the cusp, not just during NAIDOC week, but the cusp in terms of this theme of legacy, knowing that we have graduations upon us and that we will be seeing that legacy walking across the stages within the next few days. Today we have the privilege of hearing from a leader whose legacy is already underway, marked by impact, integrity, and advocacy. He will continue to shape the future, and with that same strength and vision. Mr. Joshua Creamer, barrister at law, is a proud Waanyi and Kalkadoon man from North-Western Queensland. He's a barrister at law specialising in human rights, native title, and class actions. He has played a leading role in a lot of landmark cases and class actions that reshaped and still continue to reshape history. Cases involving stolen wages and stolen generations, as well as representing the community of Palm Island following the death of Mulrunji Doomadgee. Joshua is the former chair of the Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry. in this state and has formerly held the roles of the member of the board of Legal Aid Queensland and a commissioner of the Queensland Law Commission. Joshua's work is grounded in the defence and advancement of the human rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. He brings both legal excellence and cultural responsibility, always guided by deep respect for community and commitment to justice for those who came before us as well as those to come. And I know with Joshua, some of the work that you do, Joshua, I know you may say it was grounded in your very upbringing, and I wish to acknowledge your mum here too, Sandra Creamer, who's an honorary staff member at this university as well, an honorary professor with the public health area. Joshua was awarded the Griffith University Reuben Hurricane Carter Award for commitment to social justice in 2008 and named the National Indigenous Legal Professional of the Year in 2007. He does have a UQ connection, as I said. His mother, Sandra Creamer, AM, is an adjunct professor in the School of Public Health and an inspiring advocate on both the regional, state, national and international stage as well. Joshua, we honour the vitality and impact of your work, campaigning and champion Indigenous rights. Your contributions are shaping a more just and reconciled future and a better Australia. Thank you for being with us today and offering your reflections on a profound challenge we face. How do we embrace the future when we can't acknowledge our past? I would now like you to join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Joshua Creamer, barrister at law. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bronwyn. That was a really special introduction. I'm very grateful. I obviously want to start by acknowledging country. Really proud at the moment to be working with the Yagara-speaking people who've occupied the lands from the base, from the mouth of the Brisbane River to the base of the Toowoomba Range since time immemorial. There are a few people I want to acknowledge. Obviously, I want to thank the Vice-Chancellor and the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I also want to acknowledge Professor Tracy Bunda, although she wouldn't want me to, as one of the few people who we had the opportunity to hear evidence from in the Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry, and I'll speak to that. I also, importantly, I want to say you don't have Indigenous barristers without the support of others who've been down this road, and I want to acknowledge Judge Jarrow and John Fraser, who've been both colleagues, mentors and friends for almost 2 decades, and without people like them I certainly wouldn't have had the career I've had today. And also, when I talk today, I want to talk in 2 parts about the work that led me to the inquiry, and secondly, I want to talk about some insights into the inquiry, and I actually haven't spoken publicly about the inquiry since its end. But in doing that, I want to acknowledge that in all the work I've done, I've been a part of a big team, and there are lots of other people involved in the work I've done, whether it's been on class actions, and particularly at the inquiry, we had a team of almost 50 people, and without everybody's contributions, we wouldn't be able to deliver the results we've been able to deliver. Much of the things I'll talk about I've learned from experience in working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this country. But I also want to acknowledge people like Kim Daraki, who's here in the room, because it's been through the work of working with anthropologists, historians, linguists, that I've also been able to be exposed to the many government and documentary records that are out there. So without the benefit of their reports and their work, I certainly wouldn't have been able to form the picture and the conclusions that I have. Now, I think the Deputy Vice-Chancellor's comments about Palm Island is a really important place to start. As many of you will know, I grew up in Mount Isa, and to be an Aboriginal boy from Mount Isa and to be a lawyer was certainly not 2 dreams that could ever be possible, a dream ever could be possible. But in any event, I found my way to law school. And then ultimately I landed, and I think going to law school has helped me in many ways, but it's been that ability to critically analyse all of the information that's been provided to me and not accept things on face value, which has really driven my resolve in my work. But things changed for me when I started working on that Palm Island case. And the Palm Island case is just such a significant outcome. And I'll put it in this context. You have an entire Aboriginal community that sued the state government for racial discrimination and were successful. This is in the context of where class actions, ultimately only 8% of applicants are ever successful after trial because the cases are resolved well in advance. But the state were intent on pushing this case right to the very limits of its ends. I hadn't ever been to Palm Island before I started working on the case, and all I could remember growing up was, all I knew about Palm Island was the fact that it was at some stage in the Guinness Book of Records for being described as the most violent place in the world. That was one of the few things I knew. But after working on the case and spending several years embedded in the community, Palm Island was much more than that. But Palm Island comes from a place of really an environment where the government can inflict the most horrible, traumatic and painful experiences on a group of people. Palm Island was set up as Punishment Island. In the government records you'll read that was the intent of the island. To send people to send Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people to a location that was remote, inaccessible, that they could not escape, where they could be punished. And that's the history of Palm Island. And working on the case, that history came to the fore. What I learned from working on the case was, firstly, the events surrounding Mulrunji's death. Mulrunji was walking down the street one day on Palm Island, walked past a police officer and a police liaison officer, and a few moments later found himself in the back of a paddy wagon. Within about half an hour of being put in that paddy wagon, Mulrunji dies on his cell floor, in the watch house floor. And I don't do a lot of criminal cases or inquests, but I watched the video of him in the floor. And as an Aboriginal person, I could see that moment where his spirit left his body. I could see him take his last breath. And it was a grainy footage. It wasn't like the CCTV they have now. But he died, I think his portal vein was cleaved in two, he had a broken rib, and his liver was was almost split. And the injuries were described as akin to someone being in a high-speed car accident. When a week later, when the results of the autopsy report were read out to the community on Palm Island, we see civil unrest. If you've ever been to Palm Island, it's one of the most sort of scenically beautiful places you could ever visit. But in the centre of town, there's a mall area, and next to the mall is the council office, and you have the police station and the courthouse. And after those autopsy results were read out to the community in the mall, the police station and the adjoining courthouse were burnt down. In response, we see over 100 police sent to Palm Island. Now, it was a community where there were no more than 7 police living on the island at one time, no more than 4 rostered on at any one time, and they never carried guns. But in response, as I say, over 100 police, and the response was led by the CERT, the SWAT team, and PSRT, which were the riot squad. And over the coming days, we see those teams conduct 18 raids on different homes and locations on Palm Island. And the usual practice was that they had seconded a number of vehicles, and they would surround a house at about 4 in the morning. Usually about 6 officers would enter into the home, as they're trained to do with their assault rifles, and men, women and children were then subject to these raids. Now, several years after the death, Lex Watton, his mother and his wife, Agnes and Cecilia, started the class action. And it was in response to those raids? Well, four criteria. Firstly, the investigation of the death of Mulrunji Doomadgee, not the events itself, but the investigation. Secondly, the response by the police from the time of the death and the week that followed up until the civil unrest. And then the conduct of police during those raids. What struck me most about that trial, we had close to 20 witnesses. It was ultimately, the judge was the now Chief Justice of the Federal Court. We had the hearing on Palm Island in the school or in the hall. And I spent several years working to get that case ready and then following up after the case. But what struck me most about that case was the trauma that were inflicted on people during those events. But through the work of the historian Ros Kidd, who provided a historical report on that case, I learned much more about the history of Palm Island, the fact that it was set up as Punishment Island, the fact that people were subject to those slavery conditions, forced to work for over 30 hours a week unpaid, the brutality that were inflicted upon people, the dehumanisation of Aboriginal people, and the inferiority that they were treated with. And there's a lot of things that stand out in terms of the conditions that people lived under on Palm Island during that early period. Some, for example, the mortality rate of children, Indigenous children on Palm Island was 14 times higher than the rest of Queensland. But I remember speaking to Agnes Watton about the 1957 strike on Palm. And there were a number of people who were part of that strike. But Agnes said to me, and this is Lex's mother, that we were sick of being fed bones. And that's captured in Ros Kidd's historical report, because she says, well, in the 1950s there was a superintendent on Palm Island, and because of the malnutrition he declared they'd kill 1 bullock a week to feed the population. That was to feed the non-Indigenous workers, and it was to feed the Indigenous population. 1 bullock a week was to feed 1,100 people. And that moment really captures for me just the disparity and the discontent that Aboriginal people were treated with on Palm. We see one of the superintendents who actually had established a jail for the young girls at the back of his house, and we see the abuse that they were subjected to. The importance of history and the history of Palm Island wasn't lost on Her Honour Justice Mortimer when she heard the case. And if you do have the opportunity to read her judgment, it's an important roadmap for how communities and services should be delivered. And what Her Honour said was, you can't deal with people in this community without understanding the deep roots of their history, without understanding the trauma and the legacy of that history. But from my time on Palm Island, I learned it was much more than just the Guinness Book of Records in the 1980s or 90s. But there was a deep resilience that rested in the people. There was a deep strength and enduring strength, and a desire for the same things that we all wanted: a better future for ourselves, but also, importantly, a better future for our next generation. And an enduring commitment by the Palm Island people to ensure that was a success. And I think no person embodied that better for me than Lex Watton. And when you spend time in a community and you spend time with people, you start to understand you start to understand them well. And Lex Watton is a person that people will know from photographs of one of the leaders in the riots. And there's a moment that stands out for me about the intellect and the leadership of him in that case. When he heard about the death of Mulrunji Doomadgee in the preceding hours, he went down to, I think, his father-in-law's house and grabbed a copy of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody because he'd retained a report. And he started reading about what next should happen for the community. A really remarkable example, I think, of the different pictures or different examples of a person you might get as opposed to what you read in public. But Palm Island, after I did that case, I walked away thinking, I just want to be involved in cases that are going to make a difference. The big cases that can make some impact. I was then involved in the series of the stolen wages class actions. That was started by Hans Pearson, walking into Bottom's English Lawyers in Cairns about 10 years before the Stolen Wages Queensland case started. Hans too had spent time on Palm Island, and in fact his daughter's house was one of the homes that was raided. And Hans, like many men of his time, was a stockman. And it was through working on that case that I really started to understand Queensland's history, not just located on Palm Island, but how all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people have been affected by almost 165 years of policy and legislative failure. What I learned from working on the Palm Island case was that around the time of British contact in Queensland, and that's not 1788, because if you think about contact, it moves across Australia over time, and Kim will tell you from working in the Kimberleys that it wasn't until the 1920s that we saw the second wave of contact or settlement in the Kimberleys. And so for Queensland, up until 1830, 1840, not much changed from the many decades and centuries before. But after Leichhardt's expedition, Queensland started to open up to the settlers, to the British. At around that time, again, Ros Kidd estimates that Queensland had an Indigenous population of about 200,000 people. In we see contact, and around 1865 we see the Industrial and Reformatory School legislation, which was introduced to have children who were deemed neglected put into institutions. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, by virtue of their race, were automatically deemed neglected and could be removed for no more than 7 years, but no less than 1 year. And by the end of the 1890s, we see that 200,000 population reduced down to 25,000 people. That impact then, we see that entire population, roughly 22,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, moved to settlements, missions and reserves across the state. Now, having worked across Queensland, Northern Territory and WA, Queensland is the most systematic in its destruction and control of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people compared to those other jurisdictions. And that is because the entire population was moved and controlled and deemed inmates and put on missions, settlements and reserves, where every aspect of their life was controlled. These weren't boarding schools. The kids weren't in dormitories like boarding schools. They were in prisons within prisons. What's different about Queensland is that Queensland wanted to completely annihilate Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture. It forbade the speaking of language, the practicing of laws and the practicing of customs, and it made sure those things were penalised. With it came an education system and a mandatory requirement that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children would be educated to the age of grade 4. And I'm generalising here, it's hard to capture 165 years of history in an hour, but educated to the age of, to the level of grade 4. Children at the age of about 5 or 6 on these missions would be separated from their family members and put into dormitories and separated by gender. And contact with your family outside prescribed times, including siblings, would be severely punished. Now, at the age of about 12, girls were deemed old enough to work, and they were sent out to work as domestics. And one of the great things about Queensland is because of the way that this system was structured, there are so many documentary records retained that support this process. I've read individual requests for Aboriginal girls to be sent down to work as domestics. I've seen the note saying they've been given £2 to buy the ticket on the train. I've seen the correspondence going back and forward. I've seen the train ticket. I've seen the wage books. I've seen the employment documents. They are retained by the state. Now, the boys at the age of 12 were deemed old enough to go and work on stations, and that's why we see many men like Hans Pearson who worked on different cattle stations and different properties across Queensland. Now, what was different about stolen wages in Queensland was, I think the documentary evidence to support it, but B, the fact that there was a requirement for wages to be paid under an award. Those wages were required to be paid from an employer to the state, and the state kept the wages. And through that case, we could track where much of the money was spent on supporting infrastructure across the state. And so Queensland became really effective in using Aboriginal wealth to transfer that wealth to the settler population. Obviously there's the land, but the labour was used to build the pastoral industry, to support domestic work, but also then those wages were taken and used to build much of the infrastructure we continue to enjoy today. And Hans Pearson's role in that case, I think, is entirely understated, and for my mind, he's one of the true icons of our legal journey, up there with Eddie Mabo. And I say that because without Hans, we wouldn't have then the other cases I've been involved with. Stolen wages in the Northern Territory, WA, stolen generation in the Northern Territory, and more recently, I think also the contribution that these cases have had towards the announcement of a reparations scheme in Western Australia for the stolen generations. What is different about Northern Territory and WA, and you should think of WA as the Kimberley and Pilbara as one area, and perhaps the central area, and then you have the south as well. The Pilbara and the Kimberleys are very much like the Northern Territory, in that pastoralists built stations around the Indigenous population after that population was first impacted. The population was used to support those pastoralist endeavours, and there was really little control or concern from the states or the territory, the Commonwealth, over the Indigenous population on those stations. All we see is annual audits of government coming out, auditing who was there, their age, their name, and their conditions they lived under, usually under a bow shed, access to water and other services. And there was no money cycling through the system in the Territory or WA. It was, and the WA government conceded in that class action that they didn't pay any wages up until the 1960s. It was the real true essence of slavery. You see people walking out of the desert right up until, well, actually up until the 70s, but in 86 in the Territory, but you see people coming out of the desert, living a completely traditional life. I've interviewed some of these people, speak 6 or 7 Aboriginal languages, don't speak English, are illiterate and enumerate, but will tell you about the day they walked out of the desert. It might have been a full moon. They can tell you who they walked out with and what happened. And they would come to the nearest station. The police would be called. These people would be taken into the station and given documentary records and names. And so most of that generation in the Kimberleys have the 1st of July birth date. You know who they are. There might have been an estimate of their age and allocated a birth date. What really struck me about working on those cases, all of them, is the fact that you can't treat people the way they were treated without a belief that they're entirely inferior. There was many records of torture and abuse inflicted on Aboriginal populations. Tony Redman, an anthropologist who had the benefit of working with on, I think, all of those cases, took us into evidence about how people were treated on places like Mulrunji Mission and government missions. And the real lack of value that Aboriginal lives were treated with or had during that time. There were royal commissions in WA in the 30s about the treatment of Aboriginal people on pastoral stations. And there's much records of abuse, but really little in the way of anything done. What stood out for me, though, with the Northern Territory and WA was government's obsession with children of mixed descent. As I say, that there was little concern for the Aboriginal populations on pastoral stations, but there was an obsession to remove children of mixed descent. And it goes back to that theory which really developed the whole concept that Aboriginal people were some doomed race and would die out within a few generations, and children who were born of non-Indigenous fathers had the stronger blood and would not die out and would have to be assimilated into the non-Indigenous population. It wasn't really till I worked on stolen generations in the Northern Territory that I really understood the impact of those policies. What's different about the Northern Territory compared to WA and Queensland is that in Queensland and WA there was a huge demand for Indigenous labour, and that meant we needed more Indigenous children. We needed these children because we need them on our properties. And you can see the government records, you can see the government's frustrated that it can't get enough children to support the labour. But because the Northern Territory economy was much smaller, they did not have the same demand for Indigenous children. And so many of the Aboriginal children from the Territory were removed and sent interstate to Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane and all over the country. And if you were taken as a 6-month-old or 1-year-old or 2-year-old, you had no ability to understand anything about where you were from or where your identity. If you were taken as 7 or 8 years old, then you would have some memories, some early recollections about where your family and your country, and you would have a recollection about the day you were taken. But working on that case, and it really supported or showed to me the resolve of our Indigenous elders, their strength, their leadership and their determination. And I was sitting in a room in Darwin with people like Eileen Cummins, who was at that time the chair of the Stolen Generation Corporation in Darwin. And hearing about their story, the fact that I think Eileen had met with 5 or 6 prime ministers after the Bringing Them Home report and had requested they do something about reparations for stolen generations. and the fact that nothing had been done. In that meeting, we made a commitment to Eileen that we would do something. We couldn't promise we could get a case started, and if we got a case started, we couldn't promise we could win. But we could do something. And fortunately, through the support of, again, a big legal team, and we were able to start a case. And there was lots of things happened in the process of that case, but ultimately it ended largely when Prime Minister Scott Morrison came out, offered an apology and set up a $380 million reparation scheme for stolen generations in the Northern Territory and the ACT. And what struck me most about the Prime Minister's apology was when I sat down with Eileen and about 7 or 8 others of the stolen generation in Darwin. It was the fact that the media and parts of the community had continued to deny their experience. There were cases that had gone to the High Court, Kruger and Cabillo and others, and they'd been unsuccessful. So it was easy for people to say that the stolen generation didn't exist. But when I watched the announcement and I thought about Eileen, I thought, for me, the most important thing was the validation of what had happened to them. The fact that we couldn't continue to deny that the stolen generations had existed. It's the same feeling I had when the Stolen Wages WA settlement was announced to the public. And people like David Newry up in Kununurra, if you've ever been up there, called me. And for all of the Aboriginal witnesses like David and Mervyn Street, who was the lead applicant in the case was never about them. What happened to them and their wages and their treatment, it wasn't the issue. What was more important to them was what happened to their parents and their grandparents. And wanting to have those stories told and wanting to have those stories on the record and the accountability that should flow from those stories. Now, working on these cases, I realised what my role really is in our journey as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. I understood that the earliest populations of Aboriginal people in that contact period had no ability to influence their circumstances, no control over what happened to them. We then see in the 40s and 50s and 60s, I call them the people who started to strike. They had no ability to change their circumstances, but other than to sit down and say, we're not going to be treated like this anymore. We see the next generation who come out of the missions, and I think of them as the marchers, the people who marched against the Bjelke-Petersen government for the way they were treated and for an advancement of our rights. People like Cheryl Buchanan, who I have a great respect for and who was one of the members on the inquiry. My generation, I think, were the influencers before that term became cool. We have the responsibility to influence those people who make decisions about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Whether that's in government, whether that's in industry. And my responsibility is to share the stories of those people I work with those people who make decisions. And that was the motivation for putting my hand up for the Truth Telling and Healing Inquiry. I would spend time, a long time away from home, whether it was in the Kimberleys or whether it was in the Territory, and interview these really powerful, have these really powerful stories told to me. People like Teddy Briscoe, I've interviewed Teddy twice at a little community called Palati just outside Indamoo. Teddy's the last surviving person of the Coniston massacre. And I would come back to Brisbane and I would often find it hard to reconcile my life living in inner city Brisbane with what I see and feel and experience out in these communities. How can people living in Tennant Creek, who've worked for 20 or 30 years on missions, live in a shed much bigger than a bathroom cubicle, have no running water, no electricity, and be worried about where their next meal's coming from. How can that society exist today and my lifestyle and my life in Brisbane exist at the same time? And as I say, these are people who work. They work for decades. They've contributed to the development of Australia and what we know. Because I realise there's always this myth about, the pastoral industry and Australia's wealth, and it was built by these big cattle barons, but you realise actually it was just built on the back of black people out there performing the labour, and in Queensland their wages taken to build the infrastructure. They built the cattle stations, they built the roads, they built the railway, and the money they used built hospitals and other infrastructure we still enjoy. And when I'd come back from Brisbane, I would talk to people about my work. I'd talk to some of the most educated senior people, the leaders in academia, the leaders in law, and very few would understand that history. And in fact, it was a shock to most people when you start to talk about your work. And so I felt that the truth-telling and healing inquiry was an opportunity for all of us to learn, an opportunity to share those stories, to understand the vast records that are attained by the government, an opportunity to heal, but also an opportunity to advance on reconciliation. And that's what led me to being involved in the inquiry. Now, I didn't realise what I was getting in for, chairing an inquiry. I thought it might be a bit like what Judge Jarrow does. You hear the evidence, at the end of it you produce a report, and that was the job. But the truth-telling healing inquiry, that was certainly much more, and I think that role was probably 2% of the demands of my time. But I knew going into the inquiry, and there was a process, I applied, and there was a recruitment process, and I hadn't been involved in all the work in the lead-up, and I want to acknowledge the work of people like Cheryl Buchanan, Mick Gooder, Jackie Huggins, who had for over 6 years done a lot of work in leading up to the path to treaty, on consultations. And it was a bit of a passing of the baton, I suppose, in terms of me taking on that role. I knew going into the inquiry that it was at threat. It was well said by the then opposition that if they were going to get into government, then they would abolish the inquiry. And so for me, the most important thing was, I thought the best chance of survival was for people to see what the inquiry was, so that it just wasn't some foreign concept, that it wasn't divisive, and it could be something to unite all Queenslanders. And so there was a huge effort to get started. I think our terms, we were announced in April and they wouldn't let us start till 1 July, so I just went in every day, May and June, and I thought there was a real importance in getting a team established and up and running. And we were really fortunate that we had just a tremendous team of people who were absolutely dedicated to the work of the inquiry, and the members obviously, but the people behind the scenes, the names that you'll never get to see or hear. And there was a view that we should take 12 months to establish the inquiry, but anyone who knows me knows I'm not interested in sitting still, and so we got up and running in, I think it was 8 weeks. We had our ceremonial opening and we had evidence from Tracy Bunder, Flo Watson, Arnie Jackie Huggins, David Ragg, and a number of others in that first 8 week block. And a very short time after, we requested government departments to provide us with submissions, and they did. and we had 6 Director Generals and the Commissioner of Police come and give evidence. Those were the 2 things we were able to achieve. Now, I put a huge amount of pressure on the team to deliver. Firstly, to get up and running, to have the ceremonial opening, but to have witnesses and to have a government session. And I also said that we needed to have a report before the election. And you'll recall the election was, I think, the 26th of October, and the team pumped out a report on the 25th of October at 5 p.m. We were able to publish it. And that was important because it not only talked to the work we did, but also talked to the aspiration that or the roadmap that the inquiry had to do its work over the next 3 years. We put in there the amount of expenditure, I think it was about 2.8 million, so we wanted to be upfront about what we were doing. And leading into the election, I'd written to all the members of Parliament to an invitation to meet and to discuss the work of the inquiry. I wanted decisions to be made based on facts, which is how they should be made. And I wanted people to understand what the facts were. Now, despite the efforts, ultimately we know that it was abolished, but I think the circumstances in which the inquiry was abolished, for me, stands out that the contempt that the government showed towards not just myself as the chair of the inquiry and the other members, but the 6-year process that had gone on to get to that point, to the path to treaty. I got a call from one of our communications officer team, and they said, "Oh, the Premier's just announced in a press conference that they're getting rid of the inquiry." And they were trying to track down what was said, the commentary, and I get that in the next half an hour, and yes, there's a press conference and the Premier's asked about the inquiry, and he makes some comments about, well, people should basically stand down and we're abolishing it. And so from that time on, I was sending correspondence to the Premier and the Minister, and I think I sent about 6 correspondence requesting meetings. And each time I was told that, look, we're doing some further work and we'll meet in due course. And then a few weeks later, I think it's the first sitting of Parliament. Nobody was really expecting much to happen in the first sitting, or at least this early stages of Parliament. And I get a text message. I'm in my office with some of the team, and I get a text message saying, "Quick, turn on the parliamentary live stream. They're abolishing the inquiry." And it's like a scene out of a movie. And we've got, and you've got to remember, I'm responsible for these staff. It's a real burden. I mean, there were mornings where I'd wake up and I'm like, I've got to go and tell the staff they're all losing their jobs. But we're sitting around watching these 2 computer screens, and it says the amendment to the Olympics and Paralympics Act, and we're like, Olympics and Paralympics Act? What does this mean? And so under that, without any notice, as an amendment to that act, they'd also introduced abolishing the Truth-Telling Healing Inquiry. And they passed a motion to extend the sitting hours of Parliament so that that bill had to be passed that night. There couldn't be any sending off to committees or a second debate down the track. It had to be passed that night. And on the execution of that bill or enactment of that bill into legislation, so the signing of that bill by the governor would, our roles, the inquiry would be abolished, which happened the next morning at 9 o'clock. But as that legislation, as the Deputy Premier stood up to pass that legislation and was talking to it, I then finally get an email off the Minister with a 1-page letter attached saying, "We're abolishing the inquiry, but I'm happy to meet. Do you want to meet tomorrow?" And I thought, well, I'm not coming in tomorrow so you can laugh in my face and hand me my termination papers. But it, as I say, it demonstrated to me the real discontent that government can have towards Aboriginal people. I didn't think it was my work alone, as I say, it's the work of, I mean, it's generations we've been asking to share our story and to have that story heard, but there'd been a lot of work by people like Mick Gooder and others, and to not pick up the phone or to not have a meeting really showed to me that at any time government, no matter how powerful, influential or significant we think we are as Aboriginal people, government can always stand on you, on top of you, and bypass you. So it's a really important lesson for me going forward. But there are, I think, many things to take away from the experience of the inquiry, and people do understand what they've lost. I went to the theatre last night to see Dear Son, and people come up to me, and non-Indigenous people come up to me and talked about their disappointment in the fact that the inquiry had been abolished. But I also feel as though we achieved our goal, and that was to ensure people knew the importance of the inquiry and what would be lost. And I want to contrast that with the fact that at the same time the inquiry was established, the Treaty Institute was established, and it was abolished at the same time. But people really do understand the work of the inquiry and the importance of it. Now, in the last few moments, I think I want to speak to the next generation, but for me, there is no next generation without what I call the forgotten Australians. You know, our elders, those ancestors, those people that contributed to the Australia we all enjoy today, but in many cases are just left out there sitting, dying. In the cases that we've been involved with, and I saw that recently, we might have evidence from 20 or 30 people, and by the time the case is resolved a year or two later, a third of them have passed away. And there are many, many more like them out there sitting, and we've done little to acknowledge and respect their contribution to our community. Because it is my generation that really have that responsibility to continue to advance those ambitions that they had. What struck me most about the work of the inquiry was people like Flo Watson, David Ragg, Leslie Williams, Tracy Bunda, people who in people like David and Flo and Leslie, who were inmates on missions, who were subjected to the most horrible levels of abuse that humans could inflict or that a government could inflict upon its people, but who've taken that and who are the most dedicated people who are working the hardest towards reconciliation, who every day put out their hand to the rest of us to say, come and walk on a journey of reconciliation with me. And I always want to make sure that the work that I do acknowledges the contribution of people like them and the people like Hans Pearson, Minnie MacDonald and Mervyn Street in our stolen wages cases, and the many, many people who I've sat down and interviewed and shared with me stories that I know family and others haven't heard, and I know is often the first time and the only time they'll tell those stories. And to continue to acknowledge the importance of truth-telling. Without a strong foundation and acknowledging our history, we can't go to the next stage of having that unity and reconciliation that we all yearn for. I want to leave it on that note, and again thank the University of Queensland for the opportunity to speak tonight.
We'll sit down. Thank you. I think the reception you've just received, Josh, speaks volumes, so thank you for coming and sharing your personal and professional experiences on truth-telling and healing with us. It's very good to hear you speak again, in fact, impressively without notes. That's how you do that for that long, but I was very privileged last year to have attended the ceremonial hearing at the inquiry, and where as chairman you spoke, and I recall you inviting people to learn more about the state's history, and for myself I've certainly taken that on board. I'm from New Zealand. I came 15 years ago, but the situation here is obviously very different, and I took it upon myself to learn, and I do acknowledge the guidance of my Indigenous colleagues at the university who've helped me, and of course the facts can be really brutal to hear sometimes. We've heard more about that today, so thank you. But we've got a little time before 5 o'clock for a question and answer session, so I'll attend on Michael Parkinson.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we could do an Oprah Winfrey and run around with the...
Yeah, well, we have some pre-submitted questions for discussion. So the first question that's come in, Josh, is this: has anything that was put in place during preparations for the truth-telling and healing inquiry survived and that could be built upon?
Yes, it has, and thank you for that question. So Indigenous data sovereignty, one of the key foundations of the work that we did, and ensuring we had people giving evidence with free, prior, informed consent. So we did a lot of work around that. But importantly, and I think it's probably the first time I've worked in an area where we had trauma-informed, healing-aware at the centre of the work we're doing, and Tracy would be able to speak to that experience. But in the days that following the announcement at the press conference that the inquiry would be cut, obviously we were blindsided that it would happen that quickly. The team then reverted to a sort of a closure plan, a shutdown plan, and firstly we had to. There was certainly, our witnesses didn't want their information retained by the Department of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Partnerships, because that was the department that had controlled and inflicted so much trauma on Aboriginal people. So we had to work around a process for that. Then we worked with the state archivist to ensure that the records would be retained there. We put the information online, so on the TTHI website, I don't know, the government administered that, so I'm not sure if it's still there. And actually some of the now opposition members of Parliament wanted to read into the record on Parliament all those documents we had released. So you see this sort of frantic hours after when that bill's introduced, a lot of members standing up, speaking about the importance of the inquiry and speaking into the official record, those statements, those documents. But yes, material has been retained by the state archivist, so there is a base there. If there is another inquiry at some stage, whether that's 5 years, 10 years or 20 years, they'll be free to go about the work as they please, but it was important for us to have an official record of what the inquiry did in our 6-month period.
So what implications do you think the cancelling of the inquiries had for reconciliation?
Oh, look, I spend a lot of time working with the Aboriginal community, and people are really, really upset and sad about the loss of that inquiry, because they did see it as the first time to tell their family's story. I mean, Auntie Flo Watson's a good example. She talked about her grandmother's story. That's where it started for her. But, we are resilient, and I think, well, look, we're in the long game. We'll outstay any government, and, we'll come back again at some stage. And I want to speak to The Voice, and we talked about Megan at the start. After The Voice came out, the result of The Voice, it actually made me think, well, I'm going to put my hand up to do something. I'm not going to sit back and just let things happen anymore. And that was one of the key motivations to be involved in the inquiry. Well, so you can't sit back, you've got to put your hand up. And I think we do see this next generation of young Indigenous people saying, you know what, we're learning the histories of the past, we're better educated, we've got better access, we've got better networks. We're going to stand up and we're going to continue to advocate those things which, you know, have been important for our families for generations. So, you know, there is a legacy there, a long legacy for people to continue on with.
Yeah, thank you. And what about your non-Indigenous allies? What can we do to support truth-telling without putting an extra burden or emotional, cultural burden on the First Nations people?
Well, look, it's, you know, we've got to do it in partnership. And that's the way that the inquiry was, that's how I tried to operate the inquiry. This was something that for all Queenslanders. And what really actually really instilled a lot of confidence in me was when the inquiry was being abolished, how many non-Indigenous people and organisations stood up. You know, we saw, I think I had about a dozen different churches and religious organisations write to me and come out in support. And, you know, this isn't a journey that Aboriginal people can take themselves. And so there is, I think, a need for continued advocacy, but there's an importance in, you know, institutions like the universities and different government departments to actually take account of some of the records and the history they hold, because one of the things I wanted to do in the work of the inquiry is actually to work with organisations like University of Queensland to see what we could do. And I'll just give you a good example, and the UROC report has come out in the last few weeks. If you've had an opportunity to read part of it, it's a beautiful report, the UROC Commission in Victoria. What I wanted to do along the way was I didn't want to just finish the inquiry with a big report at the end. I wanted to look at how we could build that knowledge at all stages. I was keen to engage Dean Gibson, and you know, I'd done some work with Dean when I was interviewed on Incarceration Nation. I wanted to give him open access to record all the ins and outs, to record record people giving evidence and individual interviews. I also wanted to look at what UNSW's done and the work of Megan around the Towards Truth platform. I wanted to build a Towards Truth platform in Queensland, and that's, you know, and I got into contact with UQ, and it's partnered with one of the community legal centres down there, and they built a platform for $150,000. We actually hired the former staff member from that to put her in the inquiry, and there was a lot of work that we were doing to ensure that this truth was told at all stages of the journey. So, look, I think there is, I mean, an institution like this has got a significant amount of resources, and I don't just mean money, I mean really great people. Really great people who work here who can make an impact. You know, I think the responsibility is now on us to continue that journey until, you know, government come back to the day that they want to support another truth-telling process.
Thank you. And what about immigrants and new citizens? Do they have a role? Any recommendations for what they can do?
Look, I think that's one of the benefits of, as I say, being a lawyer, that you question everything you're told and you have this critical analysis and you inform yourself, you form your own opinions. And there's some great works out there, and I know Rachel Perkins is about to release another book, Australian Wars, and she's done some work on the, through the documentary on SBS. There's Dean Gibson's work in Incarceration Nation. There's a lot of great Indigenous storytellers, because that's who we are. We tell stories out there who have documented these things in our history. You know, inform yourself. Go and learn from these resources. Inform yourself from, things like the Bringing Them Home report, because they're out there. Don't be silent like the rest of Australia's had the benefit to enjoy or to live under. Form your own opinions about Australia's history and be engaged in that history, and be engaged with our black storytellers.
Thank you. And you spoke during your keynote about the stolen wages and the stolen generation. In your experience, what's the best way to resolve the stolen wages situation and to provide benefits that support the reintegration or remembering of the stolen generation?
Look, there's a real sense of injustice from being involved in those cases, in that you have people who worked for 20 or 30 years and they'll receive $20,000 or $30,000. And so there's a real sense that it's unfortunate people have had to resort to legal action to try and resolve these issues. You know, it's been left that long. And so, you know, and as I say, you've got people who are 3 or 4 generations employed or who worked, continue to live in poverty. It doesn't make sense to me. Under that legislation, the protection legislation, there's a provision in there that any property you acquired automatically was vested in the state. So anything you owned automatically became property of the state. And so people just have not had that opportunity to create that generational wealth, which leads to all those socio and economic issues that we know Indigenous populations are overrepresented on. But it's not just that, it's the fact that we continue to blame Aboriginal people for their own circumstances. And there hasn't been any accountability on government. There's never been a real understanding of the role that legislation and government played in creating the disadvantage that we are under today.
Thank you. Well, that's sort of drawing us to time. I'd like to finish by saying, and I think I speak for everyone here, what a privilege it's been, and online, privilege it's been for you to come and speak to us today about truth-telling and healing. It's, I shan't forget it for a long time, so thank you. But that does conclude our official proceedings for today. Can I please ask everyone to show their appreciation to Josh one last time.